The air in the elevator was different on the 40th floor. Down in the gritty, industrial heart of East Austin, where Ben Carter spent his days, the air was thick with the sweet, earthy perfume of boiling malt and the sharp, citrus tang of hops. It was honest air, filled with the dust of creation. Here, in the gleaming corporate headquarters of Maverick Creek Brewing Co., perched atop the Domain, the air was a sterile, refrigerated whisper, smelling faintly of glass cleaner and the expensive, ambiguous floral scent that clung to his ex-wife, Eleanor. Ben felt his Carhartt jacket, a comfortable second skin at the brewery, suddenly transform into a costume, a grubby declaration of his otherness. The steel-toed boots that felt so right on the brewery's stained concrete floor made a clumsy, echoing thud on the polished Italian marble of the lobby. He watched his reflection warp and glide across the mirrored walls. A man out of place, a ghost from the company's authentic past, haunting its hyper-corporate present. He clutched the thick, oil-stained leather journal under his arm, the brewer's ledger, its familiar weight a small anchor in this sea of cold, impersonal luxury. Every head that turned his way seemed to carry the same silent judgment, a polished condescension that measured his worn jeans and faded work shirt against their tailored suits and clicking heels. This wasn't his world. It was the world Eleanor had built. A world where the product was no longer beer, but brand equity, and the soul of the company had been traded for a spectacular view of the city. He could see her office at the end of the hall, a glass-walled cage where she commanded her empire. The silence here was a weapon, a heavy blanket designed to suffocate the uninitiated, and Ben could feel its weight pressing down on his chest, a prelude to a confrontation he knew was long overdue, but for which he felt profoundly unprepared. The journey from the brewery to this office felt like crossing a border into a foreign country, a country where he was an unwelcome immigrant, and he knew, with a sinking feeling in his gut, that he hadn't been summoned for a friendly chat about the next seasonal batch. He stood before her desk, a vast expanse of white marble that seemed as cold and empty as the space between them now. Eleanor Vance, his co-founder, his ex-wife, the newly crowned Brew Queen of Texas, didn't look up immediately. She was finishing an email, her fingers flying across a keyboard that made a sound like ice cracking. The office was a monument to her ambition, a minimalist temple of glass and steel overlooking the sprawling wealth of the Westlake Hills. It was a world away from his two-bedroom apartment in South Austin, where the $400 monthly rent felt like a constant tightening knot. Her white Porsche Taycan was likely parked in a reserved spot downstairs, a stark contrast to the beat-up Ford F-150 he nursed through traffic every morning. Finally, she looked up, her eyes scanning him with a practiced, dispassionate appraisal. "Ben," she said, her voice smooth and devoid of any shared history. "Thanks for coming up. Close the door." He did, the heavy glass door clicking shut with a soft, final thud that sealed him in. Her gaze fell to the worn leather journal in his hands. A flicker of something, annoyance, perhaps disdain, crossed her face before being replaced by a bright, corporate smile. "Ah, the famous ledger," she said, gesturing for him to place it on her desk. "Quaint. But we're a $50 million company now, Ben. We can't have our core intellectual property living in a dusty notebook. We're digitizing all key assets. It's a compliance issue." He felt the foundation of his world begin to crack, a hairline fracture in the life he had built. And he knew, with chilling certainty, that this was only the beginning of her plan. If you enjoy stories of karma, hidden secrets, and the quiet power of the underestimated, subscribe now to witness how the truth always finds a way to surface. The brewery was his sanctuary, the one place her influence couldn't fully penetrate. The familiar hum of the fermentation tanks was a constant, comforting mantra, the rhythmic pulse of his life's work. He was in the small, cluttered break room, the smell of stale coffee and yeast in the air, when one of the younger brewers, a kid named Leo, slid a magazine across the table with a wide, innocent grin. "Hey Ben, check it out. The boss is a superstar." On the cover of Forbes was Eleanor, looking regal and untouchable, a confident smile playing on her lips. The headline was a gut punch: "The Brew Queen of Texas. How Eleanor Vance Turned Water into Gold." Ben's hands felt cold as he picked it up. He flipped through the glossy pages, past the photos of her in the gleaming headquarters, until he found the article. He read her words, her carefully crafted narrative, and a cold, quiet rage began to build in his chest. She talked about the company's brand story, its market penetration, and her vision. Then he saw it, a paragraph that stole the air from his lungs. She described the genesis of their best-selling, Solar Flare IPA, fabricating a story about being inspired by a sunset during a solo trip to Napa Valley. I had this precise flavor profile in my mind. She was quoted as saying, "A complex blend of citrus and pine with a subtle tropical finish." I spent weeks guiding my technical team, pushing them to capture that exact moment in a bottle. Ben's mind flashed back to the reality. 3 months of sleepless nights, countless failed batches, the breakthrough moment at 3 a.m., when he finally nailed the dry hopping schedule with a combination of Citra and Mosaic hops he'd sourced himself. That beer wasn't inspired by a Napa sunset. It was born from his exhaustion, his obsession, his own 2 hands. It was his soul in a bottle, and she was publicly, shamelessly, erasing him from its creation, reducing his genius to a mere technical function under her visionary guidance. That night, his small apartment felt more like a cage than a home. The distant glow of the Austin skyline, a view that usually brought him a small measure of peace, now felt like a taunt, a glittering reminder of the empire he had helped build, but was no longer welcome in. He sat at his cheap kitchen table, the offensive Forbes article lying open, Eleanor's smiling face mocking him from the page. The divorce papers were in a drawer nearby, a legal document that had severed their personal lives. But this, he now understood, was something far more brutal. This was a corporate execution, the demand for his ledger, the public erasure of his legacy. It was a systematic dismantling of his identity, a hostile takeover of his entire professional life. He had been so focused on the emotional wreckage of the divorce, on dividing furniture and memories, that he had failed to see the corporate war she was waging. He was Ben the artist, the charming but commercially unviable hobbyist she described to investors, a relic to be managed and eventually discarded. He poured a glass of whiskey, the burn in his throat doing little to quell the cold fire in his stomach. He felt a surge of helpless despair, the feeling of a man being pinned down by a machine he couldn't fight. And then, a memory surfaced, faint at first, then sharp and clear. It wasn't of Eleanor. It was of his old mentor, a grizzled, retired brewmaster named Sam, who had given him a crucial piece of advice a decade ago, long before Maverick Creek was even a registered LLC. "Your recipes are your life, son," Sam had said, his voice raspy. "Don't ever let the money men own your soul." The memory led to another, a stuffy lawyer's office, the smell of old paper and leather, and the weight of a thick document he had signed on his mentor's insistence. He stood up, his heart beginning to pound a new, steady rhythm, not of fear, but of purpose. He walked to the back of his closet, to a dusty file box he hadn't opened in years, and began to dig. The quarterly town hall meeting was held in the cavernous bottling facility, a transparent attempt by Eleanor to project an image of corporate floor unity that felt profoundly false. Rows of folding chairs were set up on the concrete floor, facing a hastily erected stage where Eleanor stood, a sharp silhouette in a tailored navy blue suit against the backdrop of gleaming stainless steel tanks. His tanks. Ben sat near the back, the smell of sanitizer and ozone a familiar comfort in the tense, refrigerated air. He watched her command the room, her voice amplified by the microphone, smooth and polished as the marble in her office. She spoke of synergy and leveraging brand identity, words that felt alien and invasive in this space of honest work. Then she unveiled her masterstroke, the Founders Collection, a new line of ultra-premium beers. A slide appeared on the projector screen behind her, featuring elegant bottle designs and tasting notes that were lifted, almost verbatim, from a private section of his ledger. She spoke of her creative journey, her epiphany regarding the aging process on French oak, a process Ben had spent 18 agonizing months perfecting. He felt the gazes of his team, the brewers who had worked alongside him through those long nights, a mixture of pity and confusion in their eyes. He was being erased in real time, his life's work repackaged as her corporate vision board. The final blow came when she addressed what she called legacy asset management. "To protect our most valuable intellectual property," she announced, her eyes sweeping the room and landing on him for a fraction of a second. "We are initiating a full digital transfer of all historical R&D materials. Ben's famous notebooks, our company's origin story, will be scanned, indexed, and secured in a digital vault by the end of the week, managed by the compliance department." The room applauded politely. Ben's blood ran cold. It wasn't about preservation. It was about appropriation. It was a digital cage for his soul, and he knew once that ledger was locked in her server, he would lose the last piece of tangible proof of his creation. He spent the rest of the day in a fog of calculated silence, The rhythmic clanking of the bottling line, a metronome counting down his remaining time. The sympathetic glances from his team felt like salt on an open wound. They knew. Everyone knew whose hands had bled and whose mind had toiled to create the liquid gold that funded Eleanor's empire. But they were powerless, caught in the same corporate machine that was now grinding him down. He went through the motions, checking temperatures, tasting a new experimental batch of stout, the rich notes of coffee and chocolate feeling like ash in his mouth. He couldn't fight her in a boardroom. She commanded that world with a native fluency he would never possess. He couldn't appeal to her sense of shared history. She had already rewritten it for public consumption. The divorce had been a legal severing of their personal lives, but this was a strategic dismemberment of his professional one. As the afternoon light faded, casting long shadows across the brewery floor, the memory of that dusty file box in his closet returned. No longer a faint echo, but a blaring alarm. Inside it, he knew, was the licensing agreement, the document born from his mentor's paranoia. He had dismissed it then as legal overkill, but now it felt like the only weapon he had left. But a weapon was useless without a target, without knowing the full scope of the enemy's attack plan. He needed to see what she was doing behind the firewall, beyond the polished presentations. He needed to find the unredacted version of her ambition. As the last of the second shift crew clocked out, their tired goodbyes echoing in the cavernous space, a cold, hard resolve settled in his gut. The building would be empty, the servers humming quietly in the dark, and a ghost from the company's past was about to haunt its digital corridors. The journey from the brewery floor to the 40th floor headquarters that night felt like ascending through the circles of hell in reverse. He left the familiar, yeasty warmth of his world and entered the cold, silent purgatory of the corporate spire. His old co-founder keycard, a relic from a time when they were partners, still beeped green at the main entrance. A small victory that sent a jolt of adrenaline through him. The lobby was a tomb of polished marble and recessed lighting, his work boots echoing unnaturally in the oppressive silence. The elevator ride was the worst part. A slow, silent climb in a mirrored box, his own tense, unfamiliar reflection staring back at him. He looked like a thief, and in a way, he was, trying to steal back a piece of his own life. When the doors opened on the 40th floor, the only light was the cold, blue-white glow from the server room, and the distant, glittering panorama of the Austin skyline through the floor-to-ceiling windows. The air was still, carrying the faint, lingering scent of Eleanor's expensive perfume, a ghostly presence that made the hairs on his arms stand up. He walked down the carpeted hallway, his steps muffled, his heart pounding a deafening rhythm against his ribs. Her office door was a sheet of impenetrable glass, her computer a dark monolith on the stark white desk. Breaking in there was a fool's errand, an invitation for immediate termination and legal action. But he remembered the small conference room next door, the one they used to call the launch pad, where they'd sketched out their first business plan on a whiteboard. It had a network terminal, a secondary brain cell of the corporate hive. He slipped inside, the door closing with a soft hydraulic hiss, and the darkness enveloped him. He sat in one of the expensive leather chairs, the cold material shocking against his skin, and stared at the login screen. Its sterile glow the only thing illuminating the precipice he was about to jump from. His fingers, clumsy with sweat and adrenaline, flew across the keyboard. He typed in his username and password, his own name feeling like a foreign word, a key to a kingdom that was no longer his. He hit enter, the soft click of the key sounding like a gunshot in the silent room. For a heart-stopping second, a verifying credentials dialog box spun, a tiny digital arbiter deciding his fate. Then the desktop materialized. He was in. A wave of nausea and relief washed over him. He was behind enemy lines. He immediately opened the network drive, the familiar architecture of folders appearing like a map of his own history. Marketing, operations, sales, R&D. He knew Eleanor's personal executive folder would be locked down tighter than Fort Knox. But he navigated to a deep, forgotten subdirectory they had created years ago, a shared folder called Project Launch Assets, where they had dumped everything in the chaotic early days: press releases, label designs, financial models, legal drafts. It was a digital attic, full of junk, but maybe, just maybe, she had gotten careless. He started a keyword search, his mind racing. Ledger, IP, buyout, nothing. His hope began to curdle into despair. This was a mistake. He was going to get caught. Then, on a whim, he searched his own name, Ben Carter. A list of files populated, mostly old performance reviews and HR documents. But one file buried in a temporary folder from a recent board meeting stood out. BC Risk, Mitigation Strategy, PPTX. His blood turned to ice. He double-clicked. The PowerPoint presentation opened, its corporate branding a grotesque mockery of their shared dream. The first slide was titled Project Severance, Mitigating Key Person Dependency and Unlocking Full Asset Value. He clicked through, slide by slide, his breath catching in his throat. It was all there, a meticulously detailed plan to manufacture a case for his termination. It included doctored performance metrics, a schedule for an impossible performance improvement plan, PIP, and legal opinions on how to force a lowball buyout of his 40% equity. But the final slide was the one that stopped his heart. It detailed a proposed merger with a massive international beverage conglomerate, contingent on Maverick Creek proving sole, unencumbered ownership of all intellectual property. And it contained a memo from corporate counsel outlining a strategy to use an NDA he signed during the divorce to legally silence him and challenge the validity of any pre-existing IP agreements he might claim to hold. He stared at the final slide, the one outlining the use of the divorce NDA as a legal cudgel to silence him. The words blurred, the crisp corporate font swimming in the cold blue light of the monitor. It wasn't just a plan to fire him. It was a blueprint for his complete and total annihilation. The personal betrayal, the stolen credit, the public humiliation, those were merely the overture. This was the opera, a symphony of corporate warfare composed in the sterile language of risk mitigation and asset leverage. He felt a profound, chilling clarity descend upon him. This wasn't about their failed marriage anymore. It was about $50 million, and he was not a co-founder to be bought out, but a liability to be erased. The PowerPoint presentation was the declaration of war, but he knew the real evidence, the unassailable proof, would be buried deeper in the digital trenches of the network drive. His mind, once a chaotic storm of grief and anger, was now becoming a machine of cold logic. He wasn't just looking for a smoking gun. He was performing a forensic accounting of his own execution. He began a new search, this time through the labyrinthine folders of the finance department. He pulled up Eleanor's expense reports from the last 6 months, a document he'd never had cause to examine before. He saw the 5-star hotels, the lavish client dinners at Uchi and Jeffries, the first-class flights, all the trappings of the CEO lifestyle she had so eagerly embraced. But then he saw something else. Recurring monthly invoices, each for tens of thousands of dollars, paid out to a vendor he'd never heard of. Vance Strategic Solutions, LLC. There were no detailed breakdowns, just a single line item. Market Expansion Consulting. He cross-referenced the payment dates with Eleanor's calendar. The payments always went out a day or two after her trips to New York or San Francisco. Trips she always claimed were for meeting with potential distributors. A cold knot formed in his stomach as he realized the truth was likely far more insidious than simple expense padding. This wasn't just about pushing him out. It was about systematically looting the company he had poured his soul into, and he had just found the first thread of a web of deceit that went far beyond a stolen beer recipe. The name Vance Strategic Solutions echoed in the silent room, a brazen, almost mocking clue left in plain sight. His fingers flew across the keyboard, his previous adrenaline-fueled clumsiness replaced by a sharp, focused intensity. He dove into the company's vendor management system, a digital filing cabinet of contracts and incorporation documents. He found the LLC's registration papers. It was a Delaware corporation, a classic move for anyone trying to obscure ownership. But the registered agent's address was a nondescript mail forwarding service in Wilmington. There was no office, no website, no public presence. It was a ghost, a shell company designed for one purpose, to be a black hole for company funds. He felt a surge of nauseating comprehension. Every dollar paid to this phantom firm was a dollar stolen directly from Maverick Creek, a dollar stolen from his own 40% equity. He dug deeper, pulling up the original contract. The signature authorizing the engagement was Eleanor's. The co-signer, the one who approved every single invoice, was Arthur Finch, the new CFO she had hired 8 months ago, a man with a placid demeanor and eyes that never seemed to blink. Ben remembered the day Finch was hired. Eleanor had praised his aggressive growth mindset and his experience with pre-acquisition financial structuring. Now, the phrase sounded less like a resume highlight and more like a confession. This wasn't just a kickback scheme, it was a war chest. She was using company money to fund the legal and strategic assault against him. bleeding the very entity she was preparing to sell. The sheer audacity of it left him breathless. She wasn't just erasing his past, she was stealing his future, one fraudulent invoice at a time. His gaze drifted to the screen, where an internal messaging chat log between Eleanor and Finch was still open. He scrolled up through weeks of banal corporate chatter until one exchange stopped his heart. It was from the previous week. HR has finalized the BC performance file, Eleanor had written. The narrative is locked, ready for PIP initiation on your signal. Finch's reply was a single chilling word: acknowledged. He realized with a jolt that the financial fraud was only one weapon in her arsenal. The other was aimed directly at his professional character. He searched the network for the file referenced in the chat log, his heart a cold, heavy stone in his chest. He found it locked in a secured HR directory, labeled BC Performance Review Q3 PIP. It was password protected. He stared at the prompt, his mind racing through a decade of shared memories, searching for a key. Her mother's maiden name, the date they first opened the brewery. Nothing. His fingers trembled over the keyboard, a desperate, bitter laugh catching in his throat. On a whim born of pure, acidic nostalgia, he typed the name of the stray dog they had adopted together in their tiny first apartment, a scruffy mutt named Hops. The file opened. The first document was a formal performance improvement plan, a meticulously crafted piece of corporate fiction. It accused him of failing to align with strategic growth initiatives, creating production bottlenecks, and demonstrating resistance to scalable innovation. Each point was a gross distortion of his dedication to quality over mass-produced mediocrity. But it was the supporting documents that truly stole his breath. He found his last 2 annual performance reviews, documents he remembered being glowing, filled with praise for his creativity and product excellence. But these were not the documents he had signed. The text had been completely rewritten, his achievements reframed as liabilities. His signature was there at the bottom, a perfect digital forgery, scanned and pasted with chilling precision. He felt a violation so profound it was almost physical, as if someone had reached into his past and rewritten his identity. They hadn't just plotted to fire him. They had built a fraudulent paper trail to justify it, poisoning his entire professional history. He was no longer Ben Carter, the award-winning brewmaster. He was a difficult, underperforming employee, a problem to be managed and discarded. Scrolling to the bottom of the file, past the fabricated warnings and doctored metrics, he saw a short, redacted addendum from the head of HR, a woman Eleanor had hired right after the divorce. It referenced a prior similar case and cross-linked to a sealed file, citing the successful use of a comprehensive non-disclosure agreement to ensure a smooth transition and mitigate reputational risk. The name on the sealed file was one he vaguely recognized: Chloe Sterling, a bright, ambitious junior analyst from the marketing team who had resigned suddenly about a year ago. The official story was that she'd left to care for a sick family member, a narrative that had always felt thin and abrupt. Now Ben understood it was a lie, another carefully constructed piece of corporate theater. His access level as a co-founder, an oversight they had clearly not yet rectified, gave him clearance. He clicked on the file. It wasn't a performance review. It was an internal investigation. Inside was a series of emails from Chloe to the previous HR director, the one Eleanor had replaced. The emails started as nervous inquiries, then escalated into a formal whistleblower complaint. Chloe had discovered irregularities in the expense accounts of the new CFO, Arthur Finch, and had flagged what she believed was an undeclared financial relationship between him and a key supplier. She had documented everything, attaching spreadsheets and receipts. The response was swift and brutal. The next file was a memo from Eleanor to the company's outside counsel, instructing them to handle the Chloe Sterling situation with maximum discretion and finality. The final document in the folder was a severance agreement. It included a substantial payout and an ironclad NDA that barred Chloe from ever speaking about her employment, her resignation, or any financial practices she had observed at Maverick Creek. The truth hit Ben like a physical blow. This was a pattern. Finch wasn't just her co-conspirator. He was a liability she had been protecting long before the plan to oust Ben had even begun. Chloe hadn't just been silenced. She had been a dress rehearsal for his own execution. He now held the complete anatomy of the conspiracy in his hands. The shell company for siphoning funds, the forged documents to destroy his reputation, the legal precedent for silencing anyone who discovered the truth. He leaned back in the cold leather chair, the glow of the monitor illuminating his face, and for the first time that night, the fear and the grief were completely gone, replaced by a crystalline, unshakable calm. He took a deep breath, pulled a small encrypted flash drive from his pocket, and began to copy the files. The soft whirring of the data transferred the only sound in the heart of the sleeping empire he was about to burn to the ground. The drive back to South Austin was a blur of neon signs and red taillights bleeding across his rain-slicked windshield. The adrenaline that had coursed through him in that cold, dark conference room had subsided, leaving behind not fear or exhaustion, but a profound and unnerving calm. It was the calm of a man who had already lost everything, and therefore had nothing left to risk. He parked the F-150, the familiar groan of the engine dying into the quiet hum of the city night, and walked up to his apartment, the weight of the encrypted flash drive in his pocket a dense, physical reminder of the truth he now carried. He didn't turn on the lights. He walked to his cheap kitchen table, and in the pale, ghostly light filtering in from the street, laid out his arsenal. On one side, the flash drive, a cold, modern sliver of black plastic containing a digital map of Eleanor's treachery. On the other, the dusty, leather-bound folder containing the original IP licensing agreement, its pages yellowed and smelling faintly of his mentor's cigar smoke from a decade ago. He ran a hand over the embossed title, the paper a tangible link to a time when Maverick Creek was a shared dream, not a corporate battlefield. He knew he was outmatched in her world of hostile takeovers and boardroom politics. He was a brewer, a craftsman. He needed a different kind of craftsman now, a master of a darker art. He pulled out his phone, his fingers scrolling past the numbers of friends and family, past his old mentor, Sam, until he found a name he had saved years ago. A number given to him by another small business owner who had been systematically crushed by a larger competitor. He had never thought he would need it. He pressed the call button, the phone feeling cold against his ear, and after 2 rings, a voice answered, not with a friendly greeting, but with a crisp, impossibly calm, "Thorne." Ben found himself in a downtown law office that was the philosophical opposite of Eleanor's glass and steel perch. Marcus Thorne's firm occupied the 3rd floor of a historic brick building, the air thick with the scent of old paper, leather, and brewed coffee. There were no panoramic views of the city, only tall, crowded bookshelves filled with legal texts that seemed to absorb the sound and lend a monastic gravity to the room. Thorne himself was a man in his late 50s, dressed in a perfectly tailored but unassuming charcoal suit, his face a mask of disciplined neutrality. He listened, without interruption, for nearly an hour as Ben laid out the entire story, his voice steady and devoid of the emotional wreckage he felt inside. He spoke of the Ledger, the Forbes article, the forged performance reviews, the shell company, and the silenced whistleblower, Chloe Sterling. When he was finished, he pushed the flash drive and the original licensing agreement across the vast mahogany desk. Thorne picked up the agreement first, his long, slender fingers handling the old paper with a surgeon's care. He read for 10 minutes, his eyes scanning the dense legal text, his expression unreadable. Then he put it down, inserted the flash drive into his computer, and navigated the files with a quiet, unnerving efficiency. He didn't react with shock or outrage. He simply absorbed the data, his mind processing the architecture of the conspiracy. "This is exceptionally thorough," Thorne said, his voice a low, precise baritone. "The financial fraud is actionable. The forged HR documents establish a clear pattern of constructive dismissal, and the Chloe Sterling case provides precedent for malicious intent." He paused, leaning back in his leather chair, the springs groaning softly. "But the licensing agreement... Mr. Carter, this is not a shield. This is a tactical nuclear weapon." Thorne's gaze was sharp, analytical, cutting through Ben's despair. He explained that a simple lawsuit would get bogged down in court for years, while Eleanor bled the company dry. They needed a different strategy, one that targeted not just her money, but her reputation and the very foundation of the impending merger she was counting on. He pointed a finger at the screen, at the invoices for Vance Strategic Solutions. "She thinks she's been clever, creating a legal entity to receive the funds," Thorne said, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. "But a shell company is a box with a locked door. We just need to find the other person who has a key." Returning to the brewery the next morning was an act of supreme self-control. He walked through the familiar yeasty air, the scent of boiling wort a comforting anchor in a sea of deceit. He had to perform the part of the defeated man, the slow-moving target awaiting the final blow, while Thorne's words echoed in his mind. "We need an official record of inquiry. We need to create a catalyst inside the system." His target was David Chen, the head of the company's 3-person internal audit committee. Chen was a quiet, meticulous man who had been with Maverick Creek since the beginning, a holdover from a time before Eleanor's corporate polish had lacquered over everything. He was a man of numbers and rules, and Ben knew he held no personal loyalty to Eleanor's new regime, only to the integrity of the balance sheet. A direct accusation would be corporate suicide, triggering an immediate lockdown. Instead, Ben scheduled a formal meeting with Chen under a plausible pretext. As a 40% equity holder, he needed a certified valuation of the company's intellectual property assets for his personal estate planning. It was boring, bureaucratic, and utterly believable. He sat in Chen's small, tidy office, a space filled with spreadsheets and compliance manuals, and patiently waited as Chen explained the valuation process. Then, Ben made his move, feigning the confusion of a creative who didn't understand finance. "I was just looking at our vendor expenses," Ben said, his tone carefully casual. "And I was curious about the payment protocol for high-value consultants. For instance, this Vance Strategic Solutions firm gets a huge monthly retainer, but the invoices are just a single-line item. Is that standard practice?" He watched Chen's face. There was no dramatic reaction, only a subtle tightening around his eyes, a brief pause in his breathing. The auditor's instinct, that sixth sense for a thread that, if pulled, could unravel a universe of fraud, had been triggered. Chen gave a non-committal answer about reviewing vendor payment protocols, but as Ben stood to leave, the auditor's quiet voice stopped him at the door. "Ben," Chen said, not looking up from his computer, his voice flat and professional. "For my records, could you send me the state incorporation number for that LLC? I seem to have misplaced it." The file on Chloe Sterling was more than just evidence. It was a ghost that haunted the entire conspiracy. Thorne had been clear. A living, breathing witness who could testify to Eleanor's pattern of behavior would be invaluable, transforming a financial dispute into a story of systemic corporate abuse. Finding her, however, required a delicate touch. The ironclad NDA she had signed was designed to instill terror, and a lawyer's letter would only send her deeper into hiding. Ben had to build a bridge back to the person, not the potential witness. He started with the last known address from her HR file, a dead end. He then spent a long night scrolling through the digital ether, a private investigator of his own past. He finally found her on a professional networking site, her profile deliberately generic, her job title, logistics coordinator for a medical supply company in San Antonio, a world away from the ambitious marketing analyst he remembered. He knew a direct message would scream lawsuit. He needed a different key to unlock that door. He remembered her passion, the one thing she talked about more than marketing campaigns. A small, no-kill dog shelter in East Austin that Maverick Creek had sponsored for a charity event years ago. The next morning, he drove to the shelter and made a substantial anonymous donation, but asked the director to send the formal thank you acknowledgement to Chloe Sterling, citing her as the original inspiration for his support. He was banking on a single spark of human decency. A week passed in silence. Then, one evening, an email appeared in his personal inbox. The subject line was simply, "A thank you." It was from Chloe. She wrote about her surprise, how touched she was that he remembered her work with the shelter. The email was cautious, polite, a carefully constructed wall of pleasantries. He wrote back immediately, keeping the tone light, sharing a funny story about a recent brewing mishap, never once mentioning Eleanor or Maverick Creek. He was rebuilding a fragile trust, one sentence at a time. Her reply came faster this time, the tone slightly warmer, more relaxed. He could feel the wall beginning to crumble, brick by brick. The final sentence of her email, however, was a flare sent up in the dark, a sign that the ghost was ready to talk. "It's really good to hear from you, Ben," she wrote. "I hope everything is okay over there. I heard things got complicated after I left. With the legal framework being built by Thorne and the internal audit quietly ticking like a time bomb under David Chen's desk, Ben's final task was the most difficult, to play the part of the lamb being led to slaughter. He went to work every day and endured the final, humiliating stages of his own corporate execution. He sat through meetings for the performance improvement plan with the new HR director, a woman with a practiced, sympathetic smile and eyes as cold as a morgue slab. He nodded, took notes, and asked questions so deliberately naive they bordered on pathetic, all while a hidden rule in his email client was silently forwarding every single message in the chain to a secure server controlled by Thorne's office. He was not just documenting his own demise, he was actively co-authoring it. baiting them into creating an ever more damning paper trail. He saw the smug, confident looks exchanged between Eleanor and her CFO, Arthur Finch. They saw a broken man, an artist who couldn't handle the pressures of a real business, a relic being gently but firmly ushered out the door. His compliance made them bolder, more careless. They stopped trying to hide their disdain, discussing future plans in front of him as if he were a piece of furniture. The final piece of the puzzle clicked into place when the official invitation arrived in his inbox. It was for the annual Investor and Stakeholder webcast, a major event where Eleanor would unveil the company's spectacular 5-year growth plan and, he now knew, implicitly announce the successful acquisition of his life's work. The email was glossy, full of corporate buzzwords about synergy and forward-looking momentum. It was the stage she had built for her grand coronation. He stared at the date on the calendar, a day marked for his final public humiliation. A slow, cold smile spread across his face for the first time in months. He forwarded the invitation to Marcus Thorne with a 3-word message. The stage is set. A minute later, his phone buzzed with the reply, a simple, chilling promise of the retribution to come. The documents are filed. The process server is on standby. Enjoy the show. The days leading up to the investor call were a masterclass in psychological warfare, a silent, high-stakes game of chess played across the polished concrete floors of the brewery and the hushed carpets of the 40th floor. Ben played his role with an unnerving precision, his demeanor a carefully calibrated blend of resignation and incompetence. He would forget to file a crucial supply order, forcing Finch to send a condescendingly helpful email reminding him of protocol, an email that was immediately forwarded to Thorne. He would ask a confused question about fermentation timelines in a team meeting, allowing Eleanor to publicly correct him with a patient, patronizing tone, her performance of a benevolent leader tolerating a fading asset so perfect it was sickening. Each small humiliation he absorbed was another piece of evidence, another nail they hammered into their own coffin. He could feel their confidence swelling, their caution eroding with every passing day. They were so sure of their victory, so blinded by their own narrative of his obsolescence, that they couldn't see the trap closing around them. He spent his evenings not in despair, but in preparation. He and Thorne had long conference calls, meticulously planning every contingency for the investor call. They prepared statements, organized the evidence for immediate release to the press and the audit committee, and coordinated with a forensic accounting firm that was ready to seize the servers the moment the lawsuit became public. Ben felt a strange detachment, as if he were watching a movie of his own life, a slow-burn thriller where the protagonist had already seen the final scene. He was no longer the victim of the story. He was its narrator, and he was about to write the final chapter. The night before the call, he stood on the brewery floor long after everyone had gone home. The familiar, sweet smell of malt filled the air, and the gentle hum of the cooling pumps was a steady, reassuring heartbeat. He placed his hand on the cold steel of the primary fermentation tank for the Solar Flare IPA, his IPA. It felt like saying goodbye to an old friend, but he knew this wasn't an ending. It was a reclamation. He wasn't just fighting for his money or his job. He was fighting for the soul of this place, for the truth that was steeped into every batch, a truth that no corporate presentation could ever erase. The morning of the investor call, the air in the corporate headquarters was electric with a manufactured excitement. An outside production crew had transformed the main conference room into a miniature television studio, with bright lights, multiple cameras, and a sleek, branded backdrop featuring the Maverick Creek logo. Employees in their best business attire buzzed around, sipping expensive coffee and speaking in the hushed, reverent tones reserved for major corporate events. Ben arrived in his usual work attire, clean but worn jeans, steel-toed boots, and a simple, faded blue work shirt. His presence was an anomaly, a ghost from the factory floor haunting the pristine corporate stage. He saw Eleanor across the room, a vision in a sharp crimson dress that stood out like a drop of blood against the cool blues and grays of the office. She was in her element, greeting board members with a dazzling smile, her voice a smooth, confident melody. When her eyes met his, she gave him a small, almost pitying nod, the kind one gives to a distant relative at a funeral. It was a final, dismissive gesture, the Queen acknowledging a peasant before his banishment. He didn't react. He simply took a seat in the back row, a quiet observer at his own public execution. The webcast began precisely at 10 o'clock. Eleanor took the stage, and she was flawless. She painted a picture of explosive growth, of shrewd market positioning, of a brand poised for global domination. She spoke of her vision, her passion, her unwavering commitment to excellence. She presented slides filled with upward trending graphs and glowing projections, a narrative of success so compelling it was almost believable. Ben watched the board members, their faces rapt, their belief in her absolute. He watched his own legacy being packaged, sold, and attributed to the woman who had stolen it, and he felt nothing but a profound, icy calm. He knew that the most powerful truths are often delivered not in a storm of anger, but in a quiet, undeniable moment of reckoning. He glanced at the main entrance, right on schedule, and saw the subtle shift in the atmosphere that nobody else noticed yet. A man who did not belong there, a man in a rumpled suit carrying a plain manila envelope, had just stepped past security. Eleanor was at the peak of her performance, her voice resonating with carefully rehearsed passion as she detailed the upcoming Founders Collection, the line of premium beers she had stolen directly from his private ledger. "This collection represents the very soul of Maverick Creek," she said, her eyes sweeping across the room and the camera lenses. "A culmination of a creative journey that has defined my entire career." Ben felt a bitter laugh rise in his throat, but he swallowed it down, keeping his expression neutral. His posture relaxed. He was a statue in the back of the room, a silent witness waiting for the curtain to fall. He watched the process server, a man with a face built for delivering bad news, move with an unhurried, deliberate pace along the edge of the room. None of Eleanor's team paid him any mind. They were mesmerized by her presentation, caught in the gravitational pull of her charisma. The man was invisible to them, a functionary from a world of consequences that they believed they were above. Eleanor moved to her final slide, a projection of a staggering 10-figure valuation, the prize from the impending merger with the international beverage conglomerate. "This is not just the future of Maverick Creek," she declared, her voice swelling with triumph. "It is the future of craft brewing." She paused for dramatic effect, a confident smile gracing her lips as she prepared to open the floor for questions from investors. It was in that perfectly timed, utterly silent moment that the process server reached the stage. If you are enjoying this story of betrayal and calculated justice, please like this video. It helps us bring you more stories like this. The process server did not rush. He walked up the 2 short steps to the stage with the methodical calm of a man who had done this 1,000 times. The bright studio lights seemed to catch the worn fabric of his suit, making him an island of drab reality in a sea of corporate gloss. Eleanor's triumphant smile faltered, a flicker of confusion crossing her face as he approached the podium. She opened her mouth to have security intervene, but the man was too quick, his movements economical and precise. He didn't speak to her. He simply placed the thick legal envelope on the podium directly in front of her, the crisp manila a stark, ugly contrast to the sleek, branded surface. "Ms. Eleanor Vance," he said, his voice flat and devoid of any emotion. Yet it carried across the suddenly silent room with the clarity of a gunshot. "You've been served." He turned and walked away before anyone could react, his job done, his presence evaporating as quickly as it had appeared. 100 pairs of eyes in the room and on the live webcast were now fixed on Eleanor. The confident, powerful CEO persona dissolved in an instant, replaced by a woman frozen in a spotlight, her face a mask of disbelief and dawning horror. Her hand trembled as she reached for the envelope. The sound of the paper tearing was unnaturally loud in the dead silence. She pulled out the first page, her eyes scanning the dense black text. Ben could see the exact moment the words registered. He saw the color drain from her face, her skin turning a waxy, pale white under the harsh lights. It was the notice of intellectual property license termination. It was the cease and desist order for the production, bottling, and sale of Solar Flare IPA, of Iron Heart Stout, of Riverbend Lager, of 90% of the company's revenue-generating products. It was the formal complaint detailing fraud, breach of fiduciary duty, and conspiracy. It was the end of her world, delivered on a single piece of paper. Her composure, the armor she had spent a decade forging, shattered into a million pieces. The document slipped from her nerveless fingers, fluttering to the stage like a wounded bird. Her breath came in ragged, audible gasps, the microphone amplifying her panic for the entire world to hear. The faces of the board members in the front row had transformed from adoration to stony-faced shock. The investors on the webcast were flooding the chat with frantic questions. The entire, elaborate fiction she had constructed was collapsing in real time, and she was standing in the rubble. It was into this vortex of chaos and silence that Ben Carter chose to stand up. He didn't shout. He didn't rush forward. He simply rose from his chair in the back of the room, his movements calm and deliberate. Every head turned towards him, this forgotten man, this relic from the company's past who was now, suddenly, the center of its imploding future. He didn't need a microphone. His voice, clear and steady, filled the cavernous room, cutting through the panicked whispers. "For those of you who don't know me," he began, his eyes locked on Eleanor's, "my name is Ben Carter. I am the co-founder of Maverick Creek, and more importantly, I am the sole and undisputed owner of the intellectual property that this company was built on." He held up his own copy of the licensing agreement, the old, worn leather, a symbol of authentic creation against the backdrop of her digital fraud. He let the weight of his statement settle in the room, a silence more profound than before. Eleanor stared at him, her eyes wide with a mixture of hatred and pure, unadulterated fear. Her lips moved, but no sound came out. He took a step forward, his voice dropping slightly, becoming more personal. A final, devastating blow aimed directly at the heart of their shared, broken history. "You were so focused on my signature on the divorce papers, Eleanor," he said, his voice ringing with the quiet power of absolute truth. "You forgot to read the fine print on mine. In the end, it's not the empires we build or the money we accumulate that defines us, but the integrity of our work and the promises we keep. True value isn't found on a balance sheet or a magazine cover. It's forged in the quiet hours of creation, in the honesty of our craft, and in the strength of our character. What do you believe is the ultimate measure of success? Share your thoughts in the comments below." The meeting took place in a small, windowless room adjacent to the main HR offices, a space Ben privately called the abattoir. It had the sterile, chemical smell of industrial-grade air freshener, failing to mask the faint, lingering scent of human anxiety. The air conditioning was aggressive, a constant, low hum that seemed to leach the warmth from his skin. He sat in a cheap, fabric-covered guest chair, its armrests slick with a decade of sweaty palms. Across the small table, Eleanor sat poised and serene, a stark contrast in her crimson dress, looking as if she were chairing a board meeting, not orchestrating a character assassination. Beside her was Sarah, the new head of HR, a woman whose professional empathy felt as synthetic as the potted plant in the corner. Sarah slid a thick, professionally bound document across the table. "Ben," she began, her voice a carefully modulated murmur of concern, "as you know, we value your historical contributions immensely. However, in recent months, we've observed a growing disconnect between your role and the company's strategic forward momentum." Ben didn't touch the document. He knew what it was. The Performance Improvement Plan. The blueprint for his erasure. He could see the key phrases, upside down from his vantage point. Failure to innovate. Resistance to scalable protocols. Creating production inefficiencies. Lies, all of them, meticulously documented and supported by the forged performance reviews he had found on the server. He let his gaze drift from the document to Eleanor's face. She met his look with an expression of practiced sympathy, a subtle, almost imperceptible tilt of her head. It was a masterful performance, the concerned leader forced to make a difficult decision for the good of the company. He felt a cold, clean wave of clarity wash over him. He wasn't a person in this room. He was a problem to be solved, a line item to be removed from a balance sheet before a major sale. The sheer, breathtaking audacity of her deceit was almost admirable in its purity. She was going to read from a script that she had written, based on a history that she had fabricated, to justify a future from which he was entirely excluded. And she was going to do it with a straight face. He felt the weight of his own silence, a weapon he was learning to wield with a precision that matched her own. He simply had to let her build the cage, bar by bar, before he revealed that he had always held the key. If you are enjoying this story of betrayal and calculated justice, please like this video. It helps us bring you more stories like this. The termination meeting, when it came 2 days later, was an exercise in brutal efficiency. It was held in her office, the sprawling panorama of the Austin Hills a silent, glittering testament to her victory. Arthur Finch, the CFO, stood by the window, his arms crossed, a silent sentinel of corporate power. His presence was a clear signal. This was not a human resources matter. It was a financial transaction. Eleanor didn't bother with the pretense of the PIP. She sat behind her vast marble desk, a queen on her throne, and delivered the verdict with a chilling lack of emotion. "Ben, we've reviewed the initial progress on your performance improvement plan," she began, her voice as cool and smooth as the glass walls of her office. "And unfortunately, We've seen a continued failure to meet the required benchmarks. Specifically, your refusal to sign off on the new sourcing contracts for the Q4 production run represents a direct violation of your duties and constitutes gross insubordination. The lie was so brazen it was almost beautiful. He hadn't refused. He had asked for a 24-hour extension to review the cost-benefit analysis, a standard practice he had followed for a decade. It was the pretext they had been waiting for, the manufactured cause that would allow them to bypass a more significant severance negotiation. He let the accusation hang in the air, the silence stretching uncomfortably. He looked not at Eleanor, but at Finch, whose placid expression never wavered. Then, he turned back to her, his own expression one of weary confusion, the role he had been rehearsing for days. "I see," he said, his voice quiet. "Could you just tell me, for my own understanding, which specific clause in my employment contract this action violates?" He saw a flicker of annoyance in her eyes. She hadn't expected questions, only a broken man's quiet departure. She launched into a stream of corporate legalese, quoting from a document she knew he hadn't read in years, her words a rapid-fire assault designed to overwhelm and intimidate. As she spoke, she slid a thin folder across the desk. "Given the nature of the termination for cause," she said, her voice turning sharp, "the company is not legally obligated to offer a severance. However, in recognition of your past work, we are prepared to offer a one-time payment of $20,000. He looked at the number. It was less than the cost of the watch on her wrist. It was an insult wrapped in the language of charity, the final twist of the knife. He opened the folder slowly, his movements deliberate, betraying none of the cold, calculated fury that was solidifying in his chest. Inside were two documents. The first was the severance offer, a single page detailing the pittance they were offering in exchange for his 40% stake in a $50 million company. It was a number designed not for negotiation, but for humiliation. The second document was much thicker, bound by a heavy-duty staple in the top left corner. It was the non-disclosure, non-disparagement, and full release of all claims agreement. He picked it up, feeling its physical weight. It was heavy with the force of her paranoia. His eyes scanned the first page, the dense paragraphs of legalese, a forest of traps and snares. He recognized the language, the ironclad clauses designed to buy his silence for eternity. He would be barred from discussing his employment, his termination, the company's financial practices, its recipes, its operational methods, anything and everything related to Maverick Creek. It even included a clause specifically prohibiting him from communicating with any current or former employees. The Chloe Sterling clause. He let the pages fall slowly, one by one, the soft rustle of the paper the only sound in the room besides the whisper of the air vents. He could feel Eleanor's impatience, a palpable energy radiating from across the desk. She wanted this over. She wanted his signature on the paper, the final legal seal on her grand theft. "It's a standard agreement, Ben," she said, her voice tight. "Our legal team insists on it to protect the company's proprietary information." He looked up from the document, his eyes meeting hers. He allowed a flicker of his own exhaustion to show, a crack in his armor that was part of the performance. "This is a lot," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know." Finch finally spoke, his voice smooth and condescending. "It's a very generous offer, Ben, considering the circumstances. I wouldn't let it sit on the table for too long. Once it's rescinded, it's gone." The threat was clear. "Take the scraps in your gag, or leave with nothing and a ruined reputation." He closed the folder, his hand steady, and pushed it back toward the center of the desk. His final walk through the 40th floor office was a study in controlled demolition. He carried a small cardboard box containing the few personal items from his brewery office. A framed photo of his old mentor, a worn copy of a book on yeast strains, a favorite coffee mug. It was a prop, a piece of theater for the audience of marketing associates and sales executives who watched him from behind their monitors, their faces a mixture of pity, curiosity, and thinly veiled relief. He could feel their gazes on his back, hear the sudden halt of conversations as he passed. He was now a ghost, a cautionary tale of someone who couldn't keep up with the new, glossy version of the company. He didn't look at any of them. He kept his eyes fixed on the elevator bank at the far end of the hall. Each step on the plush, sound-dampening carpet a silent countdown. The journey felt 100 miles long. He passed the gleaming glass wall of the main conference room, the space where, in just a few days, Eleanor would host her triumphant investor webcast. The irony was so thick he could taste it, a bitter metallic tang on his tongue. When the elevator arrived with a soft chime, he stepped inside. the mirrored walls reflecting a man who looked tired and defeated. The doors began to slide shut, slowly erasing the corporate world he had helped build, framing the curious faces of his former colleagues in the shrinking gap. As the doors sealed with a soft, final hiss, his phone vibrated in his pocket. He pulled it out. It was a text from Eleanor. "The severance offer is on the table until 5 p.m. tomorrow, Ben. Sign it, return it, and move on. Don't be a fool and force our hand." He stared at the message, the words glowing in the dim light of the elevator. It was the final piece of evidence, the last arrogant overreach from a person so convinced of her own power, she couldn't see the abyss she was standing on. He saved a screenshot of the message, forwarding it to Thorne with a simple note: "The bait is taken." He then opened his calendar, his finger hovering over the entry for the investor webcast. Her last and most fatal mistake. The silence in the room was a physical entity, a thick, heavy blanket that smothered the panicked energy of the preceding moments. Ben saw the live webcast feed on a monitor, the chat window a frantic scrolling waterfall of question marks and speculative panic from unseen investors around the globe. He watched Eleanor's face, a canvas of collapsing confidence, her mind clearly struggling to process the legal reality that had just collided with her meticulously crafted fiction. Her eyes, which had held the entire room captive moments before, were now wide and unfocused, darting from the legal document in her hand to Ben's calm, unreadable expression, searching for a flaw in his attack, a weakness to exploit, and finding none. He took another step forward, his worn leather boots making a soft, deliberate sound on the stage, a sound of authenticity in this temple of artifice. He was not the aggressor, he was the correction, the return to a fundamental truth. He addressed the room, his voice never rising, yet commanding the absolute attention of every person present, from the stunned board members in the front row to the terrified marketing associates huddled by the coffee station. "For the past year," he began, his gaze sweeping over the board, "Ms. Vance has been preparing this company for a sale contingent upon her demonstrating sole, unencumbered ownership of all core intellectual property." He paused, letting the implication of his first statement land. "What she failed to disclose to the board, and what she certainly failed to disclose to our potential merger partners, is that Maverick Creek Brewing Company does not own its most valuable assets. It merely licenses them." He held up his copy of the agreement again. This document, the original IP licensing agreement, signed before this company was even an LLC, contains a key person clause. A clause that states, unequivocally, that the license to produce and sell our 5 flagship beers is rendered permanently void if I, Ben Carter, am terminated, constructively dismissed, or removed from my role in product development. A collective gasp, a ripple of pure shock moved through the room. He had just vaporized the company's valuation in a single sentence. He then turned his attention, with surgical precision, to the placid CFO still standing by the window. Furthermore, as part of her strategy to illegally force my exit and seize control of the IP, Ms. Vance, with the full complicity of the Chief Financial Officer, Mr. Arthur Finch, has systematically defrauded this company of hundreds of thousands of dollars through a shell corporation, Vance Strategic Solutions LLC, created for the sole purpose of funding this conspiracy with the very money I helped earn. He looked back at Eleanor, whose face was now a ghastly shade of white, her crimson dress looking like a fresh wound. "She didn't just steal my credit," he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper, yet carrying the weight of a final judgment. "She stole your money to do it." The accusation hung in the air, dense and irrefutable. Arthur Finch's mask of detached composure finally cracked, a subtle twitch at the corner of his eye, the only outward sign of the panic raging within. Eleanor opened her mouth, a strangled croaking sound emerging, a pathetic attempt to regain control. This is a personal matter," she stammered, her voice a thin, reedy version of its former powerful timbre. A bitter, baseless attack from a disgruntled ex-husband. But the words were hollow, their power gone. No one was looking at her with sympathy. They were looking at her as a liability, a catastrophic failure of governance. It was then that David Chen, the quiet head of the Internal Audit Committee, stood up from his seat in the third row. He was not a charismatic man, but he held a different kind of power, the power of process and fact. "Mr. Carter," Chen said, his voice calm and steady, cutting through Eleanor's frantic denials. "Did you by any chance bring documentation to support your claim regarding the Shell Corporation?" Ben gave a slow, deliberate nod. He walked to the podium, calmly connected his phone to the projector, and with a single tap, the giant screen behind Eleanor flickered to life. It was not a spreadsheet. It was a simple, damning image. The wire transfer confirmation from Maverick Creek's account to Vance Strategic Solutions, followed by a screenshot of the LLC's incorporation document, listing a single director, an address that was nothing more than a Delaware mail drop, and a name he had found after Thorne's investigators had dug into the shell company's own bank records. Amelia Vance, Eleanor's sister. A wave of audible groans and angry murmurs erupted from the board members. The fraud was no longer an accusation. It was a documented, irrefutable fact displayed 20 feet high for the world to see. The company's general counsel, a shrewd man named Peterson, was already on his feet, his face grim. He strode to the stage, took the microphone from the podium, and spoke with the cold authority of a man doing damage control. "This webcast is concluded," he announced, his voice booming. "The board will be moving into an immediate closed-door emergency session. Ms. Vance, Mr. Finch, you will be escorted to the legal conference room. Do not speak to anyone. Do not access your computers." As two uniformed security guards, who had been standing discreetly at the back of the room, began to move purposefully toward the stage, Ben watched the last vestiges of power drain from Eleanor's face, replaced by the stark, naked terror of a queen who had just been checkmated in front of her entire court. 6 months later, the air in Ben's new world smelled of possibility. He stood in the heart of True North Brewing Co., a name he had chosen not for its geographical suggestion, but for its moral one. It was his brewery, built from the ground up in a restored brick warehouse in South Austin, financed by the 8-figure settlement he had won from the smoking ruins of Maverick Creek. The lawsuit had been a brutal, swift affair. Thorne's meticulously assembled evidence of fraud, conspiracy, and intellectual property theft had left the board of directors with no alternative but to capitulate. They had fired Eleanor and Finch on the spot, their termination clauses voided by their gross misconduct. The international merger had evaporated overnight, the conglomerate's lawyers fleeing from the reputational and legal blast radius. Ben had watched from a distance as the consequences cascaded. Eleanor was facing not only the company's lawsuit to claw back every fraudulent dollar, but a class action suit from investors who had been deceived by her presentations. Her name, once a celebrated brand in the business world, was now synonymous with corporate malfeasance, a cautionary tale whispered at industry conferences. The Westlake Hills mansion was on the market, the white Porsche Taycan repossessed, her social media account scrubbed into a sterile, silent void. She was a ghost, haunting the wreckage of an empire she had tried to steal. Here, in his own space, the sounds were different. There was no oppressive, weaponized silence, only the happy clang of steel, the hiss of a pressure release valve, and the easy laughter of the young brewers he was now mentoring, a team he had handpicked, including Leo from the old brewery. He ran a handful of pale, malted barley through his fingers, the smooth, dusty kernels a familiar and comforting weight. The settlement had made him wealthy beyond his wildest dreams, but the true victory wasn't the number in his bank account. It was this. It was the freedom to create without compromise, the right to sign his own name to his own work, and the quiet, unshakable knowledge that he had faced down the machine and won. He had reclaimed not just his recipes, but his soul. Yet he knew that the scars of such a battle never truly fade. They simply become a part of the map that shows you how you found your way home. He sat on the small balcony of his apartment that evening, the same modest 2-bedroom in South Austin he had kept as a deliberate anchor to reality. The skyline glittered in the distance, no longer a monument to his exclusion, but a beautiful, abstract pattern of light. He had the money to live in any glass mansion he wanted, but he had discovered that peace of mind had little to do with square footage or a panoramic view. On the small table beside him, open to a fresh, clean page, sat a new leather-bound journal, a successor to the old one that now rested safely in a fireproof box. The old ledger was a historical document, a testament to a battle won. This new one was a map for the future. He thought of Eleanor, not with anger or pity anymore, but with a kind of detached, clinical understanding. She had been so consumed with the performance of success, the magazine covers, the tailored suits, the carefully crafted narrative, that she had forgotten the fundamental truth of the product itself. She had tried to build an empire on a foundation of stolen words and forged signatures, believing that brand equity was more real than the physical, tangible quality of the beer in the bottle. She had mistaken the packaging for the substance, the status for the value, and in the end, her world, as hollow as her claims, had collapsed under the weight of its own emptiness. He took a sip of a new experimental lager he was working on, the cool, crisp liquid a testament to honest work and patient craft. He had learned that dignity was not something that could be given or taken away in a boardroom. It was something you carried inside you, a quiet, internal compass. In a world that so often rewarded the loudest voice and the most polished lie, he had proven that the truth, much like a perfectly crafted beer, has an integrity you can taste, a substance that will always eventually outlast the froth.